Hello and welcome to season 2 of Sunday Sweet Chats. My name is Charles K. Carter and I'm a queer poet who currently lives in Oregon. I'm the author of Read My Lips from David Robert Books, as well as several chapbooks, including Artificial Sweetness, which just came out from Finishing Line Press. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about our sweet guest today and discuss some sweet, sweet poetry. Hello, Travis. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Hello, thanks for having me. My name is Travis Chi Wing Lau, pronouns he, him, his. I'm an assistant professor of English at Kenyon College. I do 18th and 19th century British lit and health humanities stuff as my day job, but I fancy myself as a poet on the side. And I also happen to write a lot about queer and disability issues, particularly related to chronic pain.
All right, before we get too deep into poetry,
Yeah.
since it's Sunday Sweet Chats, what is the sweet treat that satisfies your sugary urges when you have them?
So I have a really, really intense weakness for gummy bears, particularly the Black Forest gummy bears. I have been known to devour like large family size bags, and my partner's like, this is a problem, so therefore we're not going to have them in the house at all. So when I see them, it's just like I must eat them now because I may never get them again.
All right, let's move on to some sweet poetry. You have a poem to read for us. Go ahead.
Yes. So this poem, so I'm in the process of working on a new collection. And essentially it's tentatively titled What's Left is Tender. And it's about tenderness and sort of thinking about, much in the spirit of this podcast, about tenderness as a state of being, but also as a practice, as sweetness too. And this is one of the poems I'm thinking will have a future in this collection, and it is entitled Adjustment. All along my back, there was great pain. Max Ritvo. Mark the week by a press upon that node that never dissolves, but into slow tendering. Feel the body braying back, taunting you with what it knows to be an intention quiet with future immobilities. But you hear a faint sound you call progress that I know is only a half step back from the brink of ache's dominion, my receding into what I need not contest, because a life is more than a body contested. You lift me to my feet, mercy in my steadying, before the weak undoes me for your work again. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I've read your first chapbook, which I have over
Thank
my
you.
shoulder. I love your work and the vulnerability that's in your work and how you present that as a person. And I like the idea of the staying gentle or staying soft. And I think that's really hard these days in our world where we're constantly masking ourselves in hyper competition and hyper masculinity and so many issues in our society that
Absolutely.
it's overwhelming to want to stay sensitive and soft at times. So I like that
Mhm.
idea of pushing back on that.
Yeah. And I think this has become that particular dynamic of a world that's going to make you harder because you have to survive it, and staying soft in the face of that has been actually one of the hardest things for me, because I think people who know me well have said to me, "Oh, I feel like the past, 5 to 7 years of your life in graduate school and academia, they've made me into a harder and more distant person." And I think part of what I'm doing now is trying to recover the softer parts of me that my life has maybe kind of maybe pushed to the side. I won't say taken away, but have disconnected me from. So I feel like I'm very much in the spirit of trying to figure out how to stay tender in the midst of everything.
Wow. Yeah, that's a strong statement. I definitely agree with that as someone who has worked in academia and different fashion, but worked in academia. I think as queer people standing out in society, like, yeah, how do we fit in? How do we be ourselves with people constantly trying to shrink us down?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember a long time ago, someone said, anger can be a really political feeling, but when you're always in the state of crisis and anger, what parts of you, the soft parts of you disappear? And like, that's a question I'm asking a lot these days, poetically and personally. So,
And I'm sure those things definitely intertwine. I know even when I don't think my writing is about me or what I'm going through, it is.
yeah.
I just don't have the the foresight in that moment to realize it. I'll look back at it 6 months later and be like, yep, that was 100% the shit I was trying to believe I wasn't going through.
Yeah, it's the meme, it me. It is totally it me over and over and over again. Yeah.
So tell us more about this forthcoming collection, or you just had a recent chapbook come out. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So most recently, sort of at the end of last year, a collection called Vagaries, which is, let me see if I can find it. It's behind me. It's right here. It is, weirdly enough, a collection that was written and completed before my first chapbook pairing, but kind of never found its home. The poems were written significantly earlier, but I think it took some time for it to kind of mature into the collection that I wanted it to be. But it's about chronic pain, and a sort of theory of pain that was famously put forward by a cultural theorist named Elaine Scarry, who wrote a book in 1985 called The Body in Pain, which ultimately makes the claim that pain is an unshareable thing because pain and language don't go together. So the idea that pain could be expressed at all is actually impossible. So therefore, we'll never really understand each other's pain. And I thought about that as it was really influential for me as a graduate student. But as I thought about it, I realized that's actually very much untrue. And I think about the people in my life who have written very articulately about pain and have shared their painful experiences. I think they're actually very eloquent and very inventive with metaphor. So this whole collection is trying to respond to the limits of that theory, and to think about what that means for me as a disabled Chinese American, who's trying to navigate disability and queerness as parts of my sort of daily experience. So that book just came out this past year, but I'm working on a new one. I've never written a full length collection because one, that requires commitment I am terrified of, and two, I feel like I haven't put myself in the position yet to really think about a full length collection, which is like an arc of a narrative that I want to sort of pave across multiple poems that could reach up to 60 to 100 pages or whatever the typical length is for a full length. And I think this is the next challenge for me as someone who was not trained as a poet. I sort of came to poetry as an academic. So I feel like it's like a lot of time for me to sort of figure out what it means to do that work, and to do it at such a length that I've never worked in before.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really excited that you're here, that you're having this conversation. I know we've
Mhm.
connected on social media for a while, but I was really excited that you said yes,
Yeah.
to joining me, because I appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty in your work and your social media presence, day to day. I think in the world where we're constantly masking that, it's refreshing to see that, and it gives permission to self-accept and to be able to name those things for us following you and your footsteps, even if we have different journeys and issues or whatever. You give us permission to do that. So thank you for that. And thank you for your vulnerability in this conversation.
That's such a gift. I think about why I do this work, and I think it's so easy to think about poetry as an individual act, but what we're really doing is we're writing into a community that we want. And I feel like this is the community I would have wanted when I was still figuring out what it even meant to be disabled when I was 18, figuring out that like, oh, there's a huge community of people who resonate with my experience, and I wish I had had them there. So I feel like I'm writing back to a younger self while also writing toward the community that's been there for me in real times of need. So I really appreciate that.
And I think there's a therapeutic element to that. I mean, there are some lines of therapeutic work that do that, like go back and take care of your younger self to
Yes.
feel healed and fulfilled and able to move on in your present moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess like I'm still trying to learn that poetry community. I came from, until about 7 or 8 months ago, I lived in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, like
Yeah. Oh
two
wow.
2.5, 3 hours to a decent sized city where anything artistic or musical or anything was happening. So
Can I ask where in Iowa?
Storm Lake, Iowa is where I
Yeah.
had most recently lived.
I know where that is. So my
Yeah.
partner is actually from Iowa. His family has grown up there. So like I having visited, like there's some really picturesque and beautiful places in Iowa that I wish got a little bit more visibility. But I know exactly where that is, weirdly enough.
Yeah, I grew up in a different town about half an hour from there, but like up until recently, that's where I lived, which it's kind of an oasis of itself. Storm Lake has a lot of um, immigrant populations that have
Hmm,
been welcomed or not so welcomed
sure.
over the years. So it was an incredibly interesting place to work. I was a high school teacher there to
My God.
see this beautiful melting pot. That was such a contradiction of the cornfields and wonder bread white towns around us. Um,
Sure.
but but yeah, coming from that space, um, I forgot where I was going with this.
But no, I mean that's actually really interesting. Like I grew up in a fairly, conservative southern suburb, and I think about the ways in which weirdly there was a lot of diversity, but also that sense of it felt in some ways like its own bubble. And being a writer and a creative in a place that feels like a bubble can feel very strange, right? Because it's like you intimately know it, but you also feel like it's so limiting in so many ways.
Yeah, agreed. Oftentimes, or in my experience, there's a standoffness. Like you're okay, but don't rub it in my face or don't talk
Yeah.
too directly about anything that makes me uncomfortable or
Right.
makes me question my own worldview. Um, which I think is maybe why I went into poetry, because poetry is kind of a way to fuck all that up, to say, let's look at the world differently, even if it's just for these three stanzas or whatever.
Yeah.
I realized where I was coming from the Midwest, like being in that isolated area without that poetry connection. Like growing up, I kind of got into theater,
Yeah.
and loved that and that connectedness. But then as I grew up and like, I'm not really going to pursue that more, I got into switch gears with the poetry. But
Yeah.
that felt so isolating for so long, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. Right.
I think that active creation tends to be solo, but there's so much beauty in having these conversations or workshopping with a friend or um, that really, I think, opens ourselves up.
I'm so glad that you're doing this project because I feel like a lot of poets are actually experiencing similar creative processes or exploring similar things, but just don't know other people are doing it. And it's funny that you mentioned that you come from a theater background. I hear it in your work, interestingly enough. Like I think the work has, I use the word performative here, not in a sort of negative way, as in like it is artificial, but that it speaks to an audience. And I think that's something that if we're talking about sort of a key element of something we've been talking about since the beginning of our conversation is like I feel like our work is for other people too. And I hear that a lot in your work, so that makes so much sense that you come from theater.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Mhm.
Anything else you want to share about your work or what you're doing right now?
I mean, I feel like as someone who never went through the workshop system, who never did creative writing courses in my undergrad career or grad career, I feel like the thing I've been really facing now as a poet is how to read for craft rather than interpretation. And like that's what I do for a living is to teach younger people to read critically. But actually, as a poet, I have to fight some of those tendencies. And I feel like, I'm not sure what some of your other guests might be thinking about, but something I would love to sort of see or explore with some of your other guests, or sort of think about once the sort of the show comes together in terms of its many episodes, how people think about craft as a term, which is really loaded, but I think people really think about it in fascinating ways that I was never trained to think about. So that's something that's like sitting with me right now. What does craft mean for someone who never was trained in craft?
Interesting. Yeah. It's a great question, and I think I'm just gonna let that sit and let that be. And
Sounds good.
people who watch, feel free to comment and add to the conversation.
Yes,
I think
please.
that's something I need to sit with to figure out exactly what that is to me and what that means to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Before we wrap up, there have been a lot of talks about mental health and well-being that has come out of the first season of Sunday Sweet Chats. So with this season, I'm asking the question, what keeps you sweet in such a salty world?
Oh, what a great way of putting that. And as someone who is the king of salt, I have had to come up with ways to balance the sodium intake a little bit. So I'm going to cheat and say that I have two things that I've been really doing that have kept me sweeter rather than salty. Um, I've been doing a lot of really embodied work with meditation lately. And for me, just being in my body has been really important as someone who lives a cerebral life. I teach, I think, and write. I need to be in touch with my body. So I've been doing a lot of, really simple meditation exercises and really working on breathing. I, in general, because of my scoliosis, I have really shallow breaths. So being really mindful about it on a sort of physical level has been really important. Um, the other thing that I've really come to enjoy doing, and this is such a nerdy thing, I discovered the world of tabletop role-playing games, but solo ones that you can play by yourself. So it's like essentially choose your own adventure, but like the adult version. And it's been great because I feel like it's revving a certain creative part of my brain that I feel like has been kind of lost over these years for me, where I used to just be really immersed in storytelling and sort of fantasy and science fiction, and it's gotten me back into that place, and I've actually really enjoyed that. It's made me more of a creative person after I feel like I've kind of lost my creativity a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for being here today, Travis. It's been such a sweet treat to have you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll catch you next Sunday for another episode of Sunday Sweet Chats. Bye, everyone.